Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is not Corey, but Adam Winston, former Chief Security Officer at ActZero, current Field CTO. Is that the right title for you, Adam? What do you prefer to go by?
Field CTO, Managed Services. I like to get a mouthful title. CSO is too short, so this is a better title.
Perfect. We'll see if we can find some more words to throw in there too by the end of this. The purpose of this is really CISOs and IT managers that have to wear the security hat. They face a lot of challenges. And two of them that we most often hear is that experienced security professionals are expensive and manual incident response is slow. And we've been hearing promises over the last 2 years of how AI will really revolutionize industries all around the world. If you talk to any tech company that got funding last year, they say they're using it all to put AI in whatever the heck they do. But one obvious application is security operations and automating as much of the SOC as possible. But I don't know about you, Adam. It feels like we're not quite there yet. So there's concerns about data security, hallucinations still very much present that I think are slowing things down. And that's why I invited you, Adam, on today to discuss what the future looks like for an autonomous SOC and how compliance and privacy requirements might shape that. That sounds good. You want to jump on in?
Yeah, let's do it. 100%.
Before we get into the AI stuff, the first question we always ask people first time they hop on here is, what's your hacker origin story? And what we mean by that is most people in cybersecurity, there's something, whether it was how they grew up as a kid or just slowly making their way professionally, but something got them into cybersecurity and where they're at right now. So I wanted to start, Adam, if you wanted to explain your hacker origin story and what got you here.
I love this question. I mean, a lot of new grads probably ask the same question, trying to replicate the same, career path sometimes if they're hoping to get started. Or, I think I love the word hacker because it's always like this supreme genius that has, command over software and lives in a basement and has, a whole Bitcoin archive from all his conquests. But the concept, I think, is obviously I don't fit the lifestyle. I don't look like the type of guy that would be code fighting Maze Group, even though that's my job, right? And I look at the origin of this, and obviously, in my junior to senior year, I kind of was in college in 2004. 2004 had three big things going on. One, the supreme, value of companies like Cisco, the people that were doing the build out of the internet, was collapsing, right? This thing was formerly worth more than Exxon. And now, obviously people weren't seeing as much value in that. Those routers and switches, companies like Nortel or whatever, if you remember them, were going broke. And at the same time, I was getting a whole bunch of invites to this thing called the Facebook in my Gmail. And so, when I looked at, the career opportunities as I was graduating with computer science, obviously there was a lot of different opportunities. My friends were getting jobs at Apple, some were getting jobs at Google. And so the concept was, what do I do with my career, right? I had friends that were like, hey, why don't you go work at this consulting company? They're paying really well. They'll give you this huge signing bonus. You can wear a suit. This kind of fits your lifestyle. Why don't you do that? And I remember kind of being like, well, I wanted to be an entrepreneur since I was a kid, right? I was the kid that read Forbes magazine. The only thing I ever built computers for was to play games. I never really thought anything more than that. I thought I was going to be the next guy working at Nintendo. That was the dream job. And then, when I graduated, you kind of looked at it and went, okay, well, what sort of market opportunity is still there? Some are going away. Some are kind of being created. And my dad at the time worked at a bank. And I said, well, what's the bank spending money on? Because if they're still spending money on it, it's probably a good job to get into. And he said, well, I'm really getting hosed by cybersecurity. I'm really paying through the nose for things like, these network intelligence, packet capture devices, all these super, heavy data oriented analytics tools like a SIM. And I got my CEH. I could go to parties and tell people I was actually a hacker. And I started the company Spiders on the day I graduated. And so the origin story really was, having looked at a lot of those tools, a lot of SIMs, a lot of all those other things, and just seeing the opportunity for disruption very, very early on. And so that really is kind of the hacker origin story. I wouldn't say you can call yourself a hacker until you actually either, get into penetration testing or something and can break into something, or you actually are on the blue team fighting a real world hacker and are successful. So I probably couldn't say I was an actual anointed, hacker until about 2017 when I met a live actual attacker for real that I could find and stop.
Did you like beat them in a fight or something?
I would say so. The customer would say so. I mean, you don't get points for second place, right? You either defeat them and they're out of the environment and they're not coming back, or you're looking for another vendor, right? So with the code fighting or whatever you want to call it, they're deploying trick bot, they're deploying some sort of command and control, some sort of exploit. You're not sure where they are. You got to find and get rid of them. This kind of battle, and then you got to keep them out there, keep them out of there for a while. That was definitely part of it, right?
Yeah, I had no idea you had a CEH. I mean, it sounds like you probably can hang if you really wanted to, but
yeah, I can go to the shows, I can go to the B-sides, I can go to Black Hat and do my thing. I just dress like a car salesman, so there's there's a bit of maybe this is a nice deep fake for like I'm not really this person. So other than the dress code, yeah, I'd say I can hang.
That's totally fair. So obviously, the reason I brought you on, you've done a lot of work with like machine learning and AI from actually applying it in the world of cybersecurity to help improve SOCs. Like the first thing I want to chat about though is so AI in cybersecurity. It's not new. It's been around for a while. We've been using it for quite some time. I don't know about you, but my own experience, like let's say 5 years ago, whenever someone would bring up the topic of, AI versus machine learning, I'd kind of roll my eyes. We'd seen some applications of what was then like generative AI. It was kind of silly in the output for it. Like they tried and write movie scripts and it was pure gibberish kind of thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't until like a bit recently that I really felt like, maybe there is something kind of there. And I'm curious for you, was there like some point in history over the past couple of years, maybe even longer, where you really felt like, hey, this is the moment, like I'm now drinking the AI Kool-Aid, and maybe there is some great applications for this in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think for the start of my career was sort of 2005. A lot of the, anything with machine learning or AI was mostly just sort of this lab-based science that was happening behind the scenes. I think you kind of see the pickup of it around 2010, kind of the post-Stuxnet 0-day type of environments where machine learning starts to show up pretty significantly in the analytics around a behavioral detection instead of signature detection. And it starts to get less abstract when you start to look at the efficacy of tools like the EDRs or others at stopping those kind of current 0 days based on behavior. So I think that if you look at probably the early adoption of this stuff, the Kool-Aid really starts to get into your bloodstream when you get through a real sort of polymorphic malware or APT or one of those where the attacker is just not going away. They can modify their techniques, or they can modify their code on the fly. And I look at probably the sort of moment of, I had a customer, we had sort of the traditional EDR, the traditional analytics tools, SIMs and stuff, and we got hit with CACBot, the precursor to TrickBot, right? And this thing was completely, blaster worm, get everywhere. It was on every system. It was spraying credentials. It was locking people out. It was noisy. It was using SMB, but everything SMB was on everywhere. We couldn't necessarily turn it off. So it was the first time we were kind of like running around the factory, figuring out what to do and what tools were letting us down. And I remember calling an EDR provider that had, behavior-based detections, ML-based detections, and they said specifically, "Oh yeah, for CACBot, very effective." And so we kind of deployed a new cloud-based version of the technology, and then just like that, it went quiet. Right, immediately after deploying this tool, you could start to see a lot of the different ways that this attacker was kind of moving through the environment, and their code was being modified, just shrink and stop. And so I immediately dropped. Every year I'd produce a research paper for grants as part of developing the MDR early in my career. Around 2010, every year I'd produce this paper. The paper was always about things nobody ever wanted, an antivirus program for iOS, or I had this concept of an auto containment thing where you'd have kind of a zone alarm type pop up, and you'd sort of say like, I don't want this until you ran out of processes that weren't locked away from the internet, right? So you could kind of like choose your own adventure through your own lockdown within the services. And so while those all were, nice moonshot ideas about how to do cybersecurity, the most effective one I found was augmentation of the EDR and analytics platform, specifically IPS and EDR, on machine learning. And so you started to see a lot of these mathematical programs you probably learned about in university, like, decision trees and, these other programs that were these Python type programs that would just only do large scale analysis and say, okay, well, this really does start to have real world value in portable executable or behavior based detections in EDR. On the IPS side, I think the biggest innovation in 2012 was application identification. So being able to tell the difference between BitTorrent and Skype was a very difficult thing to do on a firewall where you only had a couple packets to look at and at times. And so you see, a lot of those machine learning analysis be able to pick out the nuances and how to identify those things as just 3 packets going through a firewall. And then you have something like Palo Alto's App ID at the time being born in about 2012. So you start to see kind of these transformational things show up from the factory with machine learning and as an AI science in 2010, 2012. But it's certainly not in the lexicon of the buyer, right? You're not getting through these conversations with people and saying, oh yeah, we've got an AI-based technology. They'd say that and it would sound cool. But like you say, it's sort of sci-fi, right? They can't put their finger on what makes that algorithm at EDR A or B better than the other one until they actually see it in practice. And so you really start to see it 5 years later. About 5 years later, 2017, 2018, you start to see those 0 days start to be used very consistently in the attacks, right? A lot of the Ryuk, the Maze Group, these ransomware gangs that are just, big game hunter dropping in these things, shutting down whole networks and big networks, right? We're not talking about just any old company. They're massive healthcare. They're huge. These companies getting breached that are like Equifax, right? And so you have this concept where those brands starting to get taken down really starts to put the community in general into, okay, well, how are we going to fix this? And then a lot of people who come out of the lab and say, we have been fixing this. It's been called AI science. We just needed to be in more product and more places than you guys are used to using. So that was kind of the first Kool-Aid drink of like, this isn't, just, an IBM white paper about Watson. This is a real thing we can use to find and stop bad guys.
I remember back in the early to mid 2010s or so, like I was making fun of vendors that would like preach about all the AI that they were plugging into everything, because it totally felt like the perfect marketing buzzword kind of thing of you can't actually explain what you're doing. Let's call it AI, and hopefully the smoke and mirrors hide like what's really going on behind the scenes kind of thing.
Yeah, but there was no touch to it. Yeah, you couldn't see it, you couldn't feel it. They wouldn't show you these cluster graph diagrams or anything you really needed to be like, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about machine learning algorithms. Or, you could see it manifest in the alert or something, or the rules, right? It's kind of like, yeah, we've plugged in these new ways of detecting, portable executables, and we use machine learning to derive that new detection, but it looks exactly the same as the previous pop-up or signature detection. So it looks like BS.
Yeah. And so you talked a bit about like some of the history and growth of this leading up to your Kool-Aid moment. And you also mentioned like your own white paper. I had no idea that you wrote a bunch of white papers back in the day too, or research papers.
Five grants. I got 5 grants. That's it. They were all patentable. I never got a patent because I didn't think it would work. But anyway,
that's awesome.
Yeah.
But you even described them as moonshots, and I'm curious, like, do you have any examples of over the years maybe where AI or machine learning wasn't applied correctly within cybersecurity, or where it was kind of shoehorned in and maybe wasn't the best application? Because I feel like right now we're seeing a lot of that with specifically generative AI being put in places where it's either not mature enough or it's not the right spot for it. And I'm curious from your perspective if this is just the continuation of a trend, or if there's like any other older examples too.
Yeah, the other thing, part of it is when you go to adopt a lot of the technology or try to build the stack around trying to derive either machine learning, or you're trying to look at, utilizing a large language model or data sets or whatever, it becomes very quickly an economic argument where you're like, okay, well, what am I going to do? What am I trying to enhance? Because it's not like you can just simply, download a source code library and start getting to work like you can today, kind of, right? At the time, you either had to partner in a way with a research institution that maybe had a lot of the capacity for the build out you were looking for if you wanted to do something complex like large scale, data analysis, or you needed, massive funding, right? And so, I guess when you look at places it was applied poorly before, it was probably trying to say that you could do something specifically in cybersecurity in the open source community. So like the early versions of the open source, and I think like you think back to VirusTotal is kind of a great example. If you were a user of VirusTotal in the 2016, 17 arena, you kind of were using their early stage correlation between multiple antivirus vendors definitions and things based on binaries you were uploading, right? So you'd upload something, is this malware or not? 25 people say it is out of 70. Okay, great, right? If you were to pay for the enterprise edition, you could get this kind of like malware update sample, but you didn't have the ability to host anything. Even if you were able to download all the samples, where were you downloading them to? Most people couldn't tool their way into these algorithms to sort of advance the science, right? It was mostly just sort of parked in the institutions, like the anti-malware vendors or large-scale networking vendors that had the capacity to say, yeah, we can lose money on this for a long time. So first off, I'd say kind of open source failed us pretty early. The ecosystem wasn't really there to sort of play with different parts of this to help every vendor or consultant or whatever start to leverage AI in their practice. But then even when you kind of go over to the enterprise, you had companies that were offering SIMs and saying, oh, we can now offer you the ability to do machine learning. And usually there's only one thing wrong with something in tech where it doesn't work. It's like, oh, it's too early for the Zune or something like that. In this case, everything was wrong. Like the compute wasn't there, the data wasn't there, the expertise wasn't there, the money wasn't there. Everything failed when they tried to put machine learning into the SIM. So, that's probably the crash and burn. And then the idea, if you even look at something like Gmail and you say, okay, well, that was actually a great example of machine learning in cyber detections, is kind of like the algorithm for spam. But if you just go in ChatGPT and say, like, show me all the models that were used in Gmail, there's like 25 of them over time. So obviously the experimentation is failure, right? You are going through and saying, does this model work? Okay, for some things. Does that model work? Okay, for some things. And frankly, you don't have this sort of groundswell of even how to train these things until probably GPT-1 and the breakthroughs around training data in 2017. So, you kind of had this 5-year period of just wasting time and money, I would say, in AI in many different ways to see if something sticks, right? And some companies could afford to do that, like Google, and other companies basically were not able to do that.
Yeah, and it feels like there are still some modern parallels with that right now too. With it feels like a bit of an arms race and a fundings race right now of
yeah
trying to stay ahead of the game before the dollar dries up.
Well, I mean, if you look at since the popularity of OpenAI's ChatGPT model and their large language models, and what the community is trying to do to be like, hey, actually, we've been doing this for a while. It's just been parked in DeepMind or back in the office at Meta, and we're going to give you some open source models, or through regression, we're going to use these models to create like a DeepSeek, right? Most people are unaware of how to sort of, you're right, democratize this, to create a concept around, okay, well, I now, I don't have the money and the compute or the data or any combination of the three, right, at all to participate. So like, what am I really supposed to do if I want to build, a large language? And this is the idea of saying, okay, well, as a community, obviously for this to get in more places, it's got to be more than just one monolith, right? We're not going to have OpenAI connected like every single, packet and file on the planet and be like, okay, you guys do it.
I mean, not for lack of trying on OpenAI's part, though.
Yeah,
let's be real.
They've come the furthest, I'd say. Like,
Yes.
especially with the Copilot, are you hooked in? Are you not hooked in? Or Apple Intelligence, like how they're almost there in terms of on our stuff. But even then, what's their interest in generalizing that data versus our interest in automating certain processes internally, right? So, there is this cat and mouse game. You're right, but there's the haves and have-nots, and between the most advanced versions of these models that do very general things. If I was to change G from GPT to something else other than generative, it would be general, right? It would be, this thing can do a lot. Whereas what we're trying to do in cybersecurity is put an absolute precision needle on this thing to make sure that, we're not getting hit by malware across, the many different points of infrastructure, whether that's, network, endpoint, cloud, mobile.
I think that's actually a pretty good point where, some of the modern, we'll call it, applications for current AI, generative AI, the stuff that's all in the news right now. I'm thinking like writing blog posts or creating images or whatever. And if you're just like, having it tune up a post, if it gets a bit of grammar wrong, that's okay. That's not the end of the day. If it makes, shrimp Jesus with an extra finger or something, it's kind of fun. But in the world of cybersecurity, if it gets it wrong, like it could have an actual impact on a very real business and a like very real asset or system. And so like the accuracy, I think you made a good point there, is very important for us to be able to rely on artificial intelligence in this industry.
Yeah, I think, it's like Bigfoot with the watch in the picture. It's like, I can't believe this picture because the guy's wearing a watch. Can you lose the belief in AI if it has hallucinations from time to time? And I find surprisingly that we don't, right? I think one of the things that most people inherently trust is when it's so accurate or so helpful in one domain or another, whether that be search or whether it's got, creative or language, grammatical help, all this other stuff, that it's very, very good at language, but it's not perfect at finding information. And I think that when you go through, your own internal belief system, trust is developed over time, right? Trust is earned, right? And easily to lose when it's people, but when it's a system, you're like, okay, maybe it's not perfect at that one thing, but you still see a lot of faith put into these systems. But in cybersecurity, we haven't given it the job yet. We haven't necessarily given it the you find and block the attack for me completely, to get that very high sensitivity and losing faith. And the way I always say this when I do talks is, you like self-driving cars. Most people believe the technology is good. Would you put your 4-year-old in it by themselves to go to school? And the answer is absolutely not. Would I put my most precious cargo inside this thing and trust it whole hog, right? But if I'm behind the wheel, would I let it drive on a street by itself? Yeah, a little bit, just to see how it works. So I think that's where we are, right? We don't have full faith. We haven't given it the job. I'm surprised how much faith we give it to produce information. And at the same time, I see, these downstream risks of it going up in flames. And, we have to solve the problem much better than we're doing today for it to work.
Yeah, I'm curious, like what you think. So I think we agree that we aren't giving it full faith right now. There are obviously some concerns or reservations. Like what innovations do you think like we collectively are still waiting on before we can start fully building an autonomous SOC and really heavily relying on these tools from like start to finish, from the entire like investigation to response chain?
Yeah, I think you got to kind of give it a definition of what we want to automate, right? I think if you look at the idea of the automation part of things, the process of things like run books, right? They need to be dynamic to kind of emulate how a threat hunter would sort of respond during a critical attack. You have the concept of a unified data set, right? So like the context is important. You're usually doing lookups as a threat hunter to look at a vulnerability or to look at a, activity across multiple systems, maybe the endpoint data and the account or changes that have happened with a user down the stream. Is this actually intelligence? Is there an attacker behavior that this actually models in the wild that I should really focus on for this PowerShell script? Or is this just, something that software does on a regular basis? A lot of that stuff, from unifying the data to looking at complex dynamic run books, as well as the idea that some the hallucinations, like you talk about, the accuracy of the actual tools, the models that we're using underneath this, kind of have to be there just for us to give it the job of containment, or to allow it to go from detection all the way through just a response, right? That last mile in cybersecurity, to say nothing of the proactive job we also give the SOC, right? The hardening of the vulnerabilities, the kind of best practice configuration of our tools and software. And so if you look at, the pre-boom stuff, we're a lot further from being able to do kind of like a quality assurance test after the fact to say, okay, well, not only do you need the tool that changes to Office 365, you need to make sure all the email and file transfers and stuff still work in the intended use case. Not only do you have this vulnerability, you need to still make sure the application still works, right? So there is this concept of like automating the hardening that I think is a little further away. On the detection and response, I think if you give it kind of a narrow cone around EDR, we're very, very close, right? Like if you look at how we've been able to sort of, in MITRE testing across anti-malware vendors that use ML is a great example of this, is to say, like, we're hitting high 90s and 100% almost every time now, right? So that we're good at this game on this particular, area of endpoint. But I think that a lot of those other things have to change in order for this to sort of become autonomous. And I think if you go back through history and say, okay, well, when were kind of marquee CTOs of these cybersecurity companies out there talking about this autonomous SOC, it sort of crept into the conversation 3 years ago, right around SOC efficiency. You'd have kind of like the Google Chronicle, now I'm sure Wiz and everything else, version of the large scale SOC saying, okay, we need to scale. And that's our number one reason for going autonomous, like everything else, Google. So how do we calculate SOC efficiency on our analysts? Is it 10 times a human? Is it 25 times a human? So you have these kind of benchmarks where it's like, okay, there are critical functions on the before and after boom that you have to automate or you have to enhance in order to get to fully autonomous. And then once you get there, there's still this sort of energy consumption, right? This capital consumption. Is it a better unit cost to have a very skilled threat hunter behind the screen, even if they're 10 times less efficient than the machine doing it? Or do you have to just sort of, say we're pricing it out, we're pricing ourselves out of the market. This is going to be way better for the people to do this. Let's pull them away from this job, move them on the loop instead of being in that critical path, in the loop.
I think we're probably going to end up at a kind of hybrid model like that, where we still have humans as a part of the loop for a bit to kind of counteract some of the weaknesses that might take longer to fix within AI or longer to address in AI. Like, I'm just thinking about, again, the funny example with ChatGPT, where I feel like it's my favorite product manager right now, because if I ask it like how to do something, it'll invent a feature if it doesn't actually exist and tell me how to go set up that feature in whatever servers I'm trying to use. And these are with like coming from models where they're pumping millions and billions of dollars into them, like OpenAI, Google, Anthropic. They've got a huge amount of money, and we still have issues like that. And so it's tough for me to like get to a point where I'm confident that for like smaller applications, more niche applications, like it might still be a bit of time before we can get there. I feel like where I'm fully trusting that I can like unplug myself and just only pop in if something really, really bad pops up.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like how we used to sell computers with RAM and CPU, and the kind of class action case that they had with Intel, where they were like, you guys are doctoring what the like clock speed is as the single greatest, metric for deciding whether the computer is good or not, right? And it turns out, obviously, clock speed, and if you look back, wasn't the biggest predictor of the machine being better or worse than its competitor. It just so happened that Intel could really knock out some good clock speeds, and so you had this kind of like CPU speed being the thing out of everybody's mouth about it. And if I look at any new technology, whether it's something like AI models, and you look at how they're kind of ranked, you look at like a Hugging Face, or you look at these other rankings, and you look at the jobs they were asking them to do in order to fulfill that ranking, they're not MITRE attack test scores, right? What they are almost always is some sort of job that's generative, right? So they want you to make source code better than the next guy, or they want you to make a more believable video or audio, right? And so as you look at the cases, they're generative cases, right? And of course, you could be let down by the idea that it invents features in a product roadmap, because they're not really sort of competing on this level. But I think as businesses, especially when you're competing for, a king's ransom in terms of venture capital, or you're looking for complete market loss lead domination, you want something on your data sheet that's going to say, I am the single greatest possible model ever. And you see it all the time, where it's like Google's model is now better than OpenAI's model. And I'm like, yeah, in certain cases, sure, people would recognize, I think if they use Claude for source code, it's probably better at some use cases for generating source code. But as product managers, they're all probably still terrible at telling you there's biometrics in Snapchat when there isn't, right? Like, so, you kind of have this, this data sheet sort of competitive problem, where we're all solutions that are dying to be ranked against one another. We're dying for market dominance. We're dying for a winner and a loser. And we need a scorecard to do that. And early on, it was number of parameters, tokens. It was, they didn't even talk about like recall. They didn't talk about a lot of the things hallucination percentage. There's not a percentage, right? So you kind of look at these things and you go, well, we don't have a way to kind of measure them. So it's just kind of a subjective experience where I'm like, oh, okay, well, ChatGPT is kind of more consistently giving me a reasonably kind of salesy type answer, right? It sounds more polished. It's like it kind of reminds me of those management consultants from days of old and House of Lies, where they'd sound really convincing, and you're like, is there any real truth to any of this? Is that actually what happened in the U.S. economy over the last 10 years, or did you make all that up?
I saw a research study on, I think it's LLM Arena, it's again focusing on the generative AI applications, where it's a place where users can go and interact with these bots, and they rate like how they thought the interaction went, and like that's how they come up with this somewhat subjective grading for how they differentiate between each other. But the research study, they found that the LLMs that were more flattering with their response, like if someone goes, hey, how do I make microwave popcorn in a cast iron? And they go, oh, well, that's such a great question. That's you're so intelligent of even thinking of that kind of question. Like those are the ones that got rated higher, even though like reality is that doesn't help at all in the application. It's kind of funny. You're right that sometimes our grading can be a bit wonky with these things.
They had a wonderful podcast with the person who was in charge of coding Claude's personality. And she has conversations with Claude every day. And this was part of it, was to say, what kind of personality do I want out of this product, right? Because it's always communicating to you through text. And I think between the GPT-4o model, if you and this is totally subjective, I can't prove any of this, but I think they did add a lot of that flattery, because now instead of just answering a question, they go, that's a very interesting question. What a unique question. What a thoughtful way of putting that. And I'm like, really? I just wanted to know like GDP in Spain for the last 6 months. And you know what I mean? Like, it's really thoughtful. I think every economist ever has asked this question. So the flattery, I think, will get you everywhere when it's a subjective experience between the thumbs up, some thumbs down. And we're in all of us, just a lot of especially the engineers are like, no, give me the hard quant. I want to know speeds and feeds and, how many gigabits per second, how many tokens per second. Because I feel like if they can rationalize it to one number or one ratio, like every CIO in history, that they can make an objective data-driven approach to what they're going to use it for, and that's all there is to doing this. And I think the way our relationship to buying this stuff and our relationship to evaluating this stuff and our need to sort of buy the best, wear the best, and be the best has manifested in this kind of artificial ranking system that is just not going to have real material impact on how you end up using a general tool like this. Like that'd be like saying, like, is your uncle smart? And it's like, yeah, he's a good engineer, but have you seen him, try to change a tire? It's hilarious.
I think that's totally fair.
Yeah.
I'm curious. So like, let's say Magical Christmas Land, we fix a bunch of the current limitations, or at least the things that are holding us back from going just head first into artificial intelligence across the board, and the SOC specifically. And do we then introduce an issue of like over reliance on AI? Are there like risks we have to worry about then of if we adopt too much or too quickly, both now and in the future?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I think a lot of people are worried about because of the disruption to labor, right? Anytime you think about, capital can flow easily, labor can't, right? We can't change people's skills as quickly as we can change potentially a feature in a product, or, we can't spend our money, on the system and then, have it back when it doesn't fulfill its promise and allocate it back to labor really quickly. So it is a difficult thing when you say, okay, well, the relationship is over reliance on automation within AI that removes the skill from the individual. And we're then obviously not asking them to do a job right now that we may ask them to do later. And I think about it like this. Obviously, if we oversubscribe on AI, I think a lot of the FUD was that they're using AI on the adversarial side. And if we don't use AI, there's something tooling against our interests that's going to shut us down unless we do this thing. And I don't see any real evidence of that. We're going to talk about, I think at some point, I hope we talk about the idea of what are the bad guys doing, right, versus the good guys. But there's this marriage, I think, we have where you kind of competitive tribalism, where we just sort of say, we need more AI because the bad guy has more AI. And we're willing to sacrifice our engineers and our people because they're never going to be as good as AI, and they're never going to be as fast, and they're never going to be as smart as this contextual engine. And I'd say that you probably just are looking at, an economic reason to stop, right? When do you stop buying enough apples, right? It doesn't matter how good the apple is. You buy it when you're full, right? You buy it when you don't no longer need to keep innovating in this. And I feel like cybersecurity has these plateaus in any technology when we've sort of solved the problem, right? Like, how long did we rely on multi-factor authentication until they came up with token stealing, right? How long did we rely on 2 ports being open in our firewall when those are the only 2 ports for 2 applications that we needed and we could? So, that as innovation progresses across networks, across applications, I think when we've tooled to a certain level of satiation with AI, we will stop, and we will only keep innovating until we see the adversary demand more of us, right? So, the real truth to that question is: do the bad guys go away? Does the financial incentive or the creativity of the adversary go away when we've spent X number of dollars on AI? And is that sufficient for us to stop having people innovate on that idea to meet the adversary? And so that's really kind of the yin and the yang of this, is that we always are just in the process of trying to get the adversary into submission. And we have this false sense of security every few years and plateaus when we think we've cracked it. And, I don't know if it's the quantum computer, removing encryption, or if it's going to be an AI tooled adversary that can find a vulnerability in every line of code that we could never patch, right? There's always this sort of fear mongering about the future. And so we kind of race and put all our energy into this thing that we think is going to be a silver bullet, and it never is. So, I think that that's kind of the historic answer of what's happening. Of course, I'd love to go back to Nintendo or something and be like, can I get the job now? I'm done with cybersecurity. I don't have to stop ransomware anymore. But as long as the adversary keeps making us improve, we will.
I think you made a really good point there too, of the individual that is automated out of not having to do something anymore until they have to. Like, one of my biggest concerns with like some responsibility in managing risk at WatchGuard is if we do lean like head first into the flavor of the month right now, which is AI assisted coding. And like, let's say, the extreme end, we fire all of our junior engineers. All of that work is done using Copilot or Claude or whatever the heck we want. And it's, putting out usable code. Our velocity is just through the roof at new features and even bug fixes. But then somewhere down the line, we encounter a bug that it introduced. It's whatever debugging capabilities isn't able to fix on its own. And now we don't have anyone on staff that has any familiarity with that module or how it was written, how it should work. Like, how the heck do you solve that problem then? That's one of my big concerns with like diving just headfirst into it.
You sell yourself the rope to hang yourself. I think that, obviously, no sooner did the machine learning models start to take place than MITRE developed Atlas, right? That we started immediately talking about poisoning and manipulating these models that we were going to be heavily reliant on to potentially create backdoors, to sway opinion, to do all these other things that, obviously, you're going to build a very big factory. What if we backdoored everything in the factory? We're going to be just fine when they use it everywhere, right? And so there's a real, understanding. I mean, the number of red team engineers and defense people that jumped into OpenAI, that was probably like the top job prospect once GPT-3 hit the market, was just like, yeah, people are freaked out about this. We need to make sure the model is super secure. The prompt engineering, the jailbreaking, all these other things that we could make in my talks, I could make a meth recipe for the crowd with some jailbreaking prompts. And, they said, wow, okay, look at Walter White over here. And I'm like, exactly. I just got all kinds of other dark skills that I couldn't get before. So, obviously there's threats there's threats to, right? This model. And, not the least of which is the idea that if we're going to try to promote automation, and we're going to make sure that people are, looking at this as a job enhancer, that we're not letting them go to QA the job, right? Like the math here is that, you're producing code of a certain quality. Every code that's been produced since the dawn of time has had a vulnerability in it. Even DARPA spending, $400,000 per 10 lines of code or whatever it is to build high assurance systems have not wiped it. Like, it hasn't eliminated the vulnerability. So the idea that we're not going to introduce one just because a computer made it is laughable in itself. And you see these headlines from like Mark Zuckerberg where he's like, we don't even need junior engineers anymore. I'm like, but that's the future. Like, you're not hiring programmers that are going to become senior. So are you saying you no longer ever in the future, you don't need senior ones? You don't need any? So it's kind of like this sort of short term thinking of saying, oh, we need the value of this product to spin up its continued investment. And so we have to come up with the disruption that it's going to have. And for a long time, people were scared of saying it, but now you start to see people saying it out loud. The disruption is in the highly skilled labor that we're hoping to remove with these tools. And especially when you think about the security or downstream impacts, you're like, well, that's a very negative downstream impact. But the same companies who have had studies on the medical impact of their social media platforms, obviously have ignored very clearly the downstream negative impacts from these tools. So, is it incumbent on us to use these tools and not eliminate our staff? Yes. Do we have to hold these same companies that are making this stuff accountable for what they will obviously overlook, which is beneficial to them and detrimental to us? Yes. Is this something we can wholly rely on to stop all adversaries? I have no confidence that that's true, right? There's just no evidence that that's true. All I know is that for certain jobs, it's probably a better tool, right? And should be used instead of signature detection or whatever.
So and speaking of holding companies accountable, though, like we found time and time again that in a lot of areas, there's no such thing as like a self-regulating industry that ends up being what it needs to be. And like often it's driven by compliance or regulatory requirements from large players like the US, the EU, or like California, even as an example.
Yeah.
And I'm curious from your perspective, like how does compliance and privacy protection really impact our ability to like just dive headfirst into AI automation?
I think the cynic would say if you have large companies clamoring for regulation, they're looking for capture to keep other companies from innovating around them, right? And that, obviously we get very cynical around regulation helping companies. You have, the old school 2008, 2000, I don't even know what era they came up with, Google's mantra or mission of saying, we won't be evil. We're not going to do any evil. And the same company has great innovations, right? Waymo, DeepMind, these are kind of the precursors to a lot of what we're doing today. And so you kind of look at them and go, yeah, you guys did do a lot of good, but they're also in, court about antitrust, right? And so you kind of say to yourself, well, did you crush with all your acquisitions any kind of market, dynamics around, a new innovator, right? That could have potentially given us a better social media platform, maybe a better, search algorithm, maybe a better mobile operating system with your power and dominance. And I think AI, because it starts with such gigantic, costs and data, specifically around large language models and generative tools, that you don't see a lot of ways that regulation isn't going to be influenced so heavily by these companies, and the capture is almost immediate. And so, obviously there has to be a little bit of ownership on the community to talk about the safety of these tools. Obviously, if I can create a genetic specific virus with the data that's already inside GPT and buy a 3D printer to create a bug that kills a whole race, that's a terrifying prospect to be using this, tool for good or for bad, right? So, how do I enforce that, we make sure we protect it from getting in the wrong hands or from being able to even do this kind of thing? And I think that because the innovation is moving so quickly, it's moving faster than the security controls in it, right? It's very obvious that you can still jailbreak GPT. You can do it on 3.5, you can do it on 4, you can do it on others, right? And so your sort of surface level filtering that you've put into this, capability being taken away from the public is gone. And so even a novice can Google their way around how to do this. And then they have pro level problems they can create for everybody in other domains. So I think that the idea of an independent regulator, which is funded by, somebody other than these people, right? Somebody other than, the largest constituents, the largest stakeholders in their own survival, are not going to regulate themselves. So obviously you need this sort of separation around regulators. You need very skilled people to be able to prosecute what is good and bad for these tools. And, you need new ideas about how you're going to share them. I mean, so far it's been, we're going to hold back chips from China, and DeepSeek is a regression of the big thing. And if they get it, they're going to do bad with it. But if we get it, we're not. And you kind of look at that and you go, it's not that you won't, right? It's that you can't, right? So to me, it's really an equation that has to have a big factor, big order of magnitude put into the possibility of creating these problems instead of just the will to act on those destructive capabilities. That has to be where the enforcement focuses, and it does have to be something that is completely counter the institution protecting itself.
And if we, it's like regulation, like mandated down from a government is one piece of this, but we do have some areas where there's kind of the self-governance within industries, like things like ISO 27001. I mean, it's becoming more of a requirement for some areas, but for the longest time, it's not like you were required to have that to do business somewhere. PCI is a little different, where in order to interact with the payment card industry, you generally do need to have some sort of PCI compliance, but SOC 2 Type 2, that's more of a differentiator, although that is slowly changing to become more of a requirement. I'm curious, like, are there any notable changes to security frameworks you think that we need to have some of that kind of self-governance of letting either AI vendors or vendors like us that use artificial intelligence to like be that differentiator based off of protections and security and privacy considerations? Like, what would you like to see if it was the Adam Winston show of like how we do everything?
It's rules for thee and not for me, right? The idea is that if you had a self-governing body, so the idea of the self, let's start with who we're talking about. There are companies that innovate, there's companies that imitate, there's companies that regulate, right? And if you look at the three sort of buckets of saying, look, I as an innovator, I hope I'm making safe and good products. I have this sort of self-defining performance that I say is part of what I do every day at work, which is to try to build better products that have wider appeal, to try to be the best at what I'm doing, to try to get recognition for that. And those motives that are built into innovation, whether it's defense tech or AI or whatever, they're not really focused on trying to add brakes to their car, right? They don't really want to slow down. The most of the imperative is around just development and innovation and R&D and disruption. And if you look at the idea that there are imitators, right, there are things that are going to slow them down or force them to compete anyways. And the imitators really have an opportunity, maybe not as first mover, but a second mover, which usually doesn't make them in the market leading position to do something. And then you have these third parties, right? The usually government, regulator, consortiums, you name it, best practice providers that study the interaction between those two and say, what's a reasonable amount of reporting or enforcement that we have to put on this? How can we establish penalties? How can we establish adoption? Is it carrot? Is it stick? And I mean, for most of history, if you look at specifically the American technology apparatus, right, and you think about the defense industrial base, you have companies that are very, very, aware that they're making an incredibly sensitive piece of technology. And yet there's still not a lot of enforcement other than maybe export regulations on how it's built and who gets access to the technology and who gets access to the information throughout the supply chain. And so, even if you go back to regulation like CMMC for the defense industrial base, that was basically something that was self-reported in 2010 when they started making it, up to 2015 when they started saying, start self-reporting this. Most people didn't do it, right? That's just the truth, right? It's, if you say like, by the way, because of your own benevolence, you must, do this for the community, please, self-assess to this. And it's the rule, but there's no enforcement. Right. And then you look at the imitators that create an F-35 for 1/10 the cost, and they go, we just lost a lot of market share by doing this. Maybe now we're interested in this regulation that would at least keep them away from us. It'll add this. It's actually helpful. It turns out I should have been doing this. My medicine is now something I should have been taking because now I see the symptoms. Right. So if you look at it from that perspective, that's usually the way it's gone. And it's gone that way, whether it was HIPAA violations and breaches, whether it's SOC 2 for software providers after, you name it. You can kind of draw SOC back a few places where they kind of separated the technology and audit departments back in the Arthur Anderson days and started setting up CSOCs, but then needed a better attestation environment. So they kind of had this sort of appetite for it, born of that. But you're always learning lessons about how this can go terribly wrong first, either through, undue competition coming from somewhere else. And, you start to hear these murmurs that DeepSeek was basically accessing the back channel of GPT in order to run regression into building their more profitable model. And they say, well, okay, well, now maybe we needed some way to enforce the hosting or security or something. So they couldn't do that because we now see the loss. We now see the problem, right? But it's almost like you don't really wake up until you're sort of tapped on the shoulder to be like, hey, you just had this problem. And that's where I think that we're trying to learn those lessons, but we learn them in weird ways. And I think back to the Biden executive order around AI, where it was kind of like this sort of list of things we weren't going to do. And it's like any IT practitioner could read that and go, so what? Like, is that going to prevent the next theft? Is that going to prevent the next, bomb being made with this thing? And the answer is it wasn't, right? It's just, they want to show the community that they're thinking about it, but at the same time, they don't really have any kind of, practice that they can put in that really stops a lot of these risks. I think today, if you ask people what are the top 5 risks of AI, it's like, it takes my job. Or, it does things that, I was doing. I wanted to do that. If you ask it, okay, it's dangerous because it can make bad stuff. It's dangerous because, there's misinformation in it. It's dangerous because we're not going to be able to tell truth from reality, right? So, but you list those risks and then you say, okay, how do I regulate around those risks when I have a fragmented system now that is accessible from, in some small way, the innovation across the globe by anybody? We've completely democratized it almost immediately. So you're like, okay, well, who am I regulating? Right? How am I going to regulate? How do I regulate, the open source model user in a far-flung country that isn't beholden to my laws? So, I think with every innovation, it's kind of like we have like godlike technology and like higher, what is it, medieval institutions or something like that. Like we just don't have law and regulation keeping pace with the needs of these sort of institutions that frankly are global and fully democratized and capable of doing all these things without any reach to get in and do something. So, we do see regulation changing. We see enforcement changing. We see people getting serious about it. But it by itself needs to have some innovation. The way we do technology regulation has to be innovated on for sure.
Yeah. Man, I'm definitely going to need to have you back on because I want to get way in the weeds on some even more of this stuff too. But I had like 2 quick questions before we hang it up for today. First is, so if we're not there yet, like what is your estimate on how many weeks, months, years until we're at a point where we can really rely on automation across the board in the SOC?
I think we're close with EDR. We're not there on the dynamic runbook thing. I don't think that everything that happens on an endpoint, even if it can be detected, is fully something that can have a complete containment or reversal to where we go, good job AI, you did better than a person would have in avoiding an accident there. So I think we're close on the endpoint. I think we're probably there by the end of 26. I think if you look at the line in the sand that most companies have drawn for when we'll see a fully autonomous SOC as table stakes, and that's specifically around endpoint, network, identity, mobile. Those SOCs because you've left IoT out of the conversation for too long. You've left biometrics out. You've left social engineering out, deepfakes, that stuff. So like there are things that we haven't started working on. So you can't really say when are we going to be done because you haven't started the work. But when it comes to like fully autonomous detection and response, you're probably asking companies their progress report by 2027. And most of them should have pencils down, some ability to say most of our processes are fully automated. And that means from detection to response, containment, remediation, without the lift of a human finger, a human on the loop.
And then last one, so if we're looking at 2026, 2027, there's a lot of students going through cybersecurity studying right now that want to become a blue team member, a red team member, just want to join a SOC in some capacity. Like, what would you tell any students right now that are hoping to land a role in SOC right now, given that potential short-term future?
We used to just inject the word cybersecurity into the world of IT, right? There's 75 million IT practitioners, 5.5 cybersecurity professionals. Most people would walk around saying this is probably an underserved side of the market. They're right. It's probably different than programming or these classical disciplines in computer science that, if you graduate with a specialization in cybersecurity, I think people imagine higher paying job, more job security, more opportunities. And if you look at what's left, just because we sort of automated the process of detecting and responding to that, the factory line work of saying, okay, we're going to stop this thing malware, that thing not malware, block that account, block that IP, if that was your dream job, was to stay on the front lines of cybersecurity, I hope you thought more of yourself, that you would have this kind of, intellectual curiosity to go beyond that, Lucille Ball on the assembly line chocolate eater, right? But if you, and I don't want to denigrate anybody in the SOC, obviously, I'm not trying to do that. I guess what I'm saying is they want to automate that stuff the most and focus on threat hunting and focus on, engineering and IOC's threat intelligence. They want to focus on the adversary, the vulnerabilities. They want to innovate on that science. And that's the work still left here. And I'd say to those new grads that are out there, there's a lot of problems we haven't started working on that we're going to have to. We need a non-encryption based authentication system that's going to be able to avoid the quantum compute refactoring of encryption architecture. We need this deep fake. We need trust put into our data again. It doesn't exist. There is no watermark and no, feature of me that you can't replicate to not trick a human, right? There's very few things we're doing in parts of the networks that are forgotten. We haven't renovated, by the way. We haven't migrated to IPv6 yet. Right. You know what I mean? Like
if you look at all, and we still haven't. You're right.
When was the original target? Was like 2000, I forget, but it was a lot earlier than it is now. Right. And I look at this and I go, yeah, there's still so many different projects that we're going to probably shift focus to that haven't gotten a lot of attention yet, but are certainly part of the cybersecurity mix and problem. So they should feel very hopeful that that they're going to have a nice problem to work on, and they're going to have a fulfilling career in doing so. But it's probably not going to be in, wireline network authentication forever, right? Like we're going to expand to the cloud and mobile and satellite internet and other ways, and they're going to have different problems, right?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Like I'm not convinced that we're going to get rid of every cybersecurity job. And so there's definitely still plenty of uses in the future for some of these folks. So, Adam, this has been awesome. We're up on time. I'm definitely going to have you back on to go into some of the weeds again on some of these things. But thank you so much for.
I appreciate that. That's great.
Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to chat about this. And really interesting stuff. I appreciate it.
Thanks for setting it up. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
So thanks again, everyone, for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, all that stuff. If you have any questions on today's topics, suggestions for future episode topics, I'm on Blue Sky, itsmark.me. Adam's on LinkedIn. You can go dig him up. Both of us, all of us, are on Instagram of all places at WatchGuard_technologies. Thank you all again for listening, and you'll hear from at least me. We'll see who joins next week. See ya.